All right, class, we are in section 9 of Ishmael. This is page 88 on this PDF. This will be page 151 in your book. Starts off, and if you can notice, Ishmael is no longer on the far side of the glass. He is now on this side. The idea that the narrator is coming closer to these ideas, closer to the lever side of himself. And if you'll notice, we have the story of the levers and story of the takers here, and takers, start shooting off around 10, 12,000 years ago. In general, when most civilizations popped up, there were some that are older. But this is a really interesting section. And basically what it's talking about is the beginning of the agricultural revolution and the rise of what you're going to know as original sin. So it talks about irony here in chapter 2 on page 154. And the ironic thing that it's thinking about is saying that, when we look at the first 5 books of the Quran, the Torah, the Bible, it's all about, Genesis, Exodus, all the early days, of, these religions. And one thing that we forget is that these were written by levers about takers. And one of the reasons why people struggle with these, with the Old Testament, especially those first 5 books and believing these kind of things, is they're not seeing the allegory and the metaphors from the point of view of a lever. We're looking at it from takers because we're not levers. But these stories are not about the origin of levers. They're about the origins of takers from a lever point of view. And he's going to explain that here. But what you've got to imagine is this. Imagine that you're, a lever. You're a native person. You live off the land. You travel from place to place, just like animals migrate with the weather. And then all of a sudden you see this city pop up. And these city people, they need land for agriculture. And every year they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when you look at these cities, you see them, pooping and peeing near the water, and they're like gutting animals and processing meat. And just, like in Italy, you have that butcher's bridge where they just toss the meat and stuff and, the guts in the river. And you just see, sickness sprouting up in these cities and disease and rats and pestilence and alcoholism and drug abuse and murder and power structures like master and slave and slavery. And then all of a sudden, these people come, marching at you wearing, shiny hats with shiny spears and swords. And, there's like hundreds of them coming at you and they say, hey, I know you've been using this land, it's your land for, 300,000 years, but we need it to farm for our people, for our city. And if you don't get off, we're going to kill you. And then you start seeing for the first time massive warfare, massive genocide. So from a lever point of view, the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and all those stories is about original sin, which is, dun, 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 civilization. And not just some awful woman who ate a magical fruit. All right? So, what we're going to get is this idea of, who has the knowledge? Who has the knowledge to rule the world? And it's, of course, the gods. And that's why, in the Old Testament, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is also called the tree of the knowledge of the gods, because humans eat it and they convince themselves that they can rule the world just like gods. And of course, what we did was we turned perfect paradise, this perfect planet, Eden, into a nightmare of genocide and murder and drug abuse and pollution and disease and filth. So, if you look at that allegory, the Hittite translation of Eve means life, kind of like the hyena story. They killed everybody else to fill themselves with life at the expense of everything else. And Adam in ancient Hittite means, all of mankind. So all of mankind was tempted by the serpent, which in the Middle East represents wisdom and intelligence. So humans, were tempted by wisdom and intelligence to fill themselves with life and to believe that they had the knowledge of the gods, which is why the magical fruit is, a tree representing, agriculture. right? And of course, in class I went over the curse, how God curses people for agriculture the rest of their life, how they'll have pains in birth, which means population boom. And then he says, you shall be, you shall die, meaning you shall become extinct. So that's what the story of Adam and Eve is. And that's what we're talking about here. All right. And this that you're looking at now on page 92 on your screen, but in your book is actually page 156 and 157, is, what we discussed in class, where the gods are kind of arguing about, giving one group the fire of life, one group of animals, or one not. And, no matter what they do, it becomes, a nightmare. And of course, these aren't actual gods that Daniel Quinn is talking about, but he's talking about humans. Humans try to say, what plants get to live and what plants get to die, and what animals get to live and what animals are good, like the things we eat, and which animals are bad, like the things that eat the animals that we eat. And this is what we've kind of fooled ourselves into thinking, that we can control these things, that we can, have this power. And if you remember, I already discussed this in class to give you a preview of it. The gods are arguing, to give a fox a squirrel, or to give like a lion a gazelle. And no matter what they do, if they let the spring floods come, or or don't block the spring floods, no matter what they do, something dies. Like one day they let a lion, get a gazelle, and the gazelle curses them. The next day they let the gazelle get eaten by the lion. And then, the next day they let the lion starve, and then, he's starving and he curses the gods. And, they eat the knowledge of the tree, and they have fooled themselves into thinking that, they can control everything and that it works and everything's fine. But then the one guy who was gone, was like, no, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense at all. And then they're like, eat the fruit and it'll make sense. And he eats the fruit. Oh, yeah, now I get it. Now it makes sense. And essentially that's what we've done. We've tried to play God with the planet, and, we've convinced ourselves that we can. All right. So what's interesting is there's also, in this discussion we're looking at here on the screen, Daniel Quinn isn't bashing religion or the Bible, but what he's saying is that this is part of our path, that we had to come across the tree of knowledge of good and evil and convince ourselves that we're like gods and utterly fail, so that we would find the tree of life, which we have to assume is symbolic for the way to live life well. So for the first time in the book, what Daniel Quinn's really talking about here is that we have to find a third way to live life, a way that doesn't destroy everything, a way where we can find the tree of life, because we can't go back to being nomadic, pastoralists and leavers, because there's not enough room on the planet. There's too many of us now. So if we're going to progress forward, we can't do civilization, because that's about to make us extinct. So what we have to do now is find the tree of life, find a better way of living, something beyond civilization that's better. And so what you're looking at is the gods kind of arguing about, well, what if Adam doesn't find this tree? What if he, what if he just, what if he eats the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he just keeps convincing himself that he's a god? And we're like, yeah, he might. And if he does, he'll become, the criminal of the world. In other words, what they're saying is, if you look at this planet from any other point of view other than humans, we are the murderers. We are evil. We are the monsters. We are the destroyers. So essentially, that's what this section is discussing. All right. So one thing that we're looking at here on your screen now is this idea that if the book was written from a taker point of view, the knowledge of good and evil wouldn't have been forbidden to Adam. It would have been thrust upon him. It would have been his destiny, you know. But because it's written from a lever point of view, it was a faulty choice. The humans weren't born flawed, that they made a choice, and it was a terrible choice, right? In other words, one of the reasons why this story of Adam and Eve has been so popular is because without us knowing, it's the origin story of our culture, the Tager culture, you know, how we came to be this way. And it's written from a lever point of view, so ironically, we don't even realize that it's like a giant criticism. So basically it's saying, you know, if the people who wrote the Bible were takers, then Adam would have been the hero. This would have been his destiny. This would have been a good thing. But it's written by levers as they see, you know, the horror that humans are choosing. And that's why it's called the fall instead of the ascent or the liberation or the destiny of Adam. I thought this section was interesting as well because he points out that some levers did practice some kind of agriculture, but it was limited. They didn't, you know, wipe out other animals to do it. You know, they practiced partial agriculture. They practiced responsible agriculture. You know, I thought that was kind of interesting. And one of the things I was talking about is some of these individuals who went to full agriculture, like the Hohokam, the Pima Indians, you know, they started doing agriculture and then they just quit. They found it, you know, it was hard work. It wasn't a happy way to live. So they went back to being part of nature. But the difference between the levers and the takers is, and this could be for your compare and contrast essay as well, takers force this life on everybody else, whereas in lever society, you can choose how you live. Another point here they're making is one of the reasons why civilization doesn't admit that it's wrong is it would mean giving your life back over into the control of the gods. All right. Now, this is really, really interesting. This is the story of Cain and Abel. And what you see in this map is 8000 BC. And the little chicken scratches here by the words Tigris River and Euphrates River represent the earliest forms of agriculture and civilization. All the dots that you see down below represent, you know, all the rest of the levers in the entire world. As you can see over there in Egypt, we don't even have civilization yet. These are our first civilizations popping up along this river. By the way, they were producing, you know, literature, you know, for entertainment 3,000 years before the Bible was comprised. And a lot of this literature that was written for entertainment, we actually see in the Bible as stories of reality, which is kind of interesting, but that's a whole nother lecture. So what you see here is civilization in the chicken scratch, and all these levers, these nomadic pastoralists at 8000 BC. Now, if we flash forward ahead, all right, just 4,000 years later, you can see what has happened. Civilization is spread all over the globe and into the Middle East, and then you see a battle between what the book says is Cain and Abel. In other words, the ancient ancestors of the Hebrews, the Semites and the Hittites, you know, the nomadic pastoralists that traveled around, you know, like Moses does in the Bible, going from place to place, living off the land, are starting to be killed and pushed into this Arabian Peninsula, which, you know, is Iraq today. And they're starting to be, you know, murdered for land to make room for more civilization. So if you remember in the story of Cain and Abel, Abel offers what to God? He offers a slaughtered lamb because he represents the ancient ancestors of the Hebrews, the Semitic herders. Semite is another word for Jew or Hebrew, by the way. And then Cain offers what to God? Crops, right? He represents civilization, agriculture. And as you remember, God does not like Cain's offering, and he likes Abel's. In other words, God prefers leavers, not takers, kids. And so what happened? Cain kills Abel. And then God says, do not seek vengeance back upon Cain, because he will return vengeance upon you sevenfold. In other words, if you are like a Native American and you go up against civilization, for every one of theirs that you kill, civilization will come back with armies and wipe out 7 of yours. Now, what's interesting is the word Cain, because Cain comes from Canaanite, the Canaan Mountains, which is up here, which is where, around like Israel and going up into here, which is where civilization starts popping up. Then you also have the Caucasus Mountains up here by the word Asia Minor, which is where you get Caucasians, right? What's interesting is God curses Cain with a mark so that all will know him when he comes and say, watch out for this guy. He brings death and civilization with him. And what's interesting, kids, is that mark is the white face. Beware the white man, for where he goes, he brings death and civilization. And that is the story of Cain versus Abel. Leavers versus takers. All right. Sorry, just rolling through a little bit. Okay, so I kind of jumped ahead and we get the story of Eve and life and all this stuff up here in page 180 and 181. Which I've already, discussed in this video. All right, so that concludes section 9.